Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everyone. I am really sorry that I'm unable to join you this morning. However, as we say in Arabic, قدر الله ما شاء. Whatever God has willed has just happened. I would like to offer my thanks to the conference organizers for this kind invitation. And I would like to particularly thank to Lenny and Barbara for putting together this excellent conference celebrating the publication of the book Islamic Religious Education in Europe last year. What I would like to share with you this morning briefly is a reflection on the piece I've already contributed to the book. If you allow me now, I would like to share my brief PowerPoint. Excellent. I'm going to reflect on the concept of critical Islamic education in relation to cultural and democratic citizenship, with a special reference to Islamic schools, exploring the degree to which they could become agents of positive change within Muslim minority context of Europe. Before I go into the topic, I would like to remember my late colleague and friend, Dr. Bill Gent, for his excellent contributions to Islamic education research and teaching at the University of Warwick. We have been missing Bill dearly. I would like to frame my topic by reflecting on the following 4 points. In order to understand how Islamic schools or Islamic education in Europe is functioning, we have to look at the wider, diverse political, legal settlement frameworks in Europe that are determining religious education or presence and absence of religions within the wider national educational systems. Second, I would like to consider the close connection between the broad educational aims and the secular and democratic citizenship values. As such, we have to bear in mind the presence of secular educational ethos within diverse European educational systems. And this brings concerns over relevance or desirability of faith schools in general within such secular educational systems, and particularly concerns over relevance, desirability of Islamic ethos schools in culturally, religiously plural and secular Europe. That will be followed by recognition and that Islam and Muslims within diverse European educational systems are not free from other concerns such as Islamophobia and the increasing securitization of educational policies across European secular states. So this brings together an important dimension to bear in mind, that is the growing mistrust in how Muslims across European educational systems make use of educational spaces. And similarly, the ideological use of Islamic education space by the secular states to contain what we can roughly frame as the Muslim problem in Europe. And I would like to end my talk by drawing attention and emphasizing the significance of facilitating critical Islamic literacy within mainstream schooling and educational system in Europe, and most importantly, facilitating formation of a critical contextual Islamic education practice within diverse Islamic educational settings. So if you look at closely to the contextual challenge, we can frame this challenge by simply saying there is an undeniable question over Islam in Europe. And similarly, Islam finds it difficult to fit in within the current European political context. So we can express this maybe elegantly by saying this is Europe's Islam question and Islam's Europe question. Often people tend to focus on one dimension, but I think there's a reciprocity that we have to bear in mind. As much as Islam and Muslims are experiencing challenges within secular Europe, but Islam itself and Muslims are finding hard to be able to respond, to draw on their faith heritage and try to express it within the reality of Europe today. This is coupled with further challenges to do with migration history and the emerging post-colonial community formation across Europe. Bearing in mind, most European Muslims are coming from ex-European colonies in different parts of the Islamic world. And that brings together a wider question to do with the wider secular, liberal, democratic political framing of the society, and asking again the question whether Islam would be able to engage with this reality. In its own history, Islam has not really faced the reality of secular politics in the past, and that remains a crucial ongoing challenge to Islam. And further, we can bear in mind the reality of economic marginalization of Muslim minorities across Europe, the reality of Islamophobia, as we mentioned, extremism on the other hand, and the response, the heavy response in the form of different securitization policies that are at play in Europe. So if you look at within the Muslim communities, we also have to recognize the fact that Muslim communities are diverse, not only ethnically and culturally, but there is also an undeniable plurality within Muslims' religious or Islamic self-understandings and heritage. So appreciating and seeing this internal diversity is also an important element that has a bearing upon the wider contextual challenge we are experiencing. This brings together to go beyond some of the binaries that have been really put into motion following the post-Second World War Muslim migration to Europe. That is the question of facilitating assimilation policies versus integration policies. Maybe we have reached a point where these black and white policies of framing the issue are no longer helpful. And therefore, the idea is how, particularly education space, both Islamic and mainstream education, could be utilized to nurture a shared culture of living well together. I do believe that critical Islamic education has a lot to offer in terms of realizing this goal. Before we go into the actual perception of Islamic education and Islamic schools and how they are functioning within the current European contexts, is to briefly look at research on Islam, Muslims, and education, or Islamic education or Islamic schooling in Europe. Unfortunately, when we review this literature, it becomes very clear that it is difficult to qualify most of these studies as really critical literature because these studies mostly reflect the wider, highly politicized approaches to study Islam and Muslims in Europe. In another way of putting this dilemma is we have lots of literature that is clearly quite prejudiced in principle against Islam and Muslims. Therefore, there is no rigor into the way in which they engage with these complex educational challenges facing Muslims in Europe. Similarly, we have highly sympathetic literature where more or less no real issue has been really tackled or engaged with. And this positive kind of literature tries to oversimplify the problems and tend to look at the issues with a very sympathetic eye. Both of these, I feel, approaches are quite unhealthy, and we really need to build up rigorous critical studies on these issues that could actually gives us proper evidence upon which we could formulate policies or interventions, both within the mainstream context as well as within diverse Islamic education settings. I have cited a couple of examples for you to just look at. Two particular interesting works that came out last year. Both of them are by political scientists who look at presence of Islam in Europe today and try to make sense of their presence by using the lenses of political science. The first one is highly positive, and it has a dedicated chapter on education, the way in which it is experienced by diverse Muslim actors, particularly British Muslim. The context is in that particular book. And the story really unfolds in a very positive way, rarely picking up on any of the critical, contentious points. The second book is much more rigorous in a way that it looks at not only the case of minority Muslim faith, but looks at broadly the Christian heritage underpinning the current democratic politics in Europe. And that is in recognition of realizing that there is actually a radical deep diversity in Europe, and the democratic liberal framing should actually recognize the fact that faith communities, both minority and majority faith communities, are actually quite vital for achieving its political ethos of public justice and common good. So these are two works that are coming really out of use of political science approach, but we also have some philosophical framing of a much more directly related topic, that is Islamic schools and their presence within the secular educational culture. The last book, Culture, Identity and Islamic Schooling, a philosophical approach, is really interesting, a very rigorous, unusually rigorous book in which it tries to assess how those who formulate Islamic ethos schooling within the context of Europe and the West actually are aware of the wider challenge of being able to reconcile this Islamic ethos with the broad liberal secular goals of education. For example, the degree to which both education systems and ethos could actually accommodate the fundamental goal of empowering the learners and their agencies. And he is quite a bit of a sympathetic voice. However, he does actually highlight some of the difficult points and the possible conflictual areas between Islamic and Western educational goals. Nevertheless, his narrative ends up providing some empirical evidence and lots of really theoretical insights that tells us that actually educational heritage in Islam could become a resource of reconciling Islamic education with wider secular education, albeit the actors who are running Islamic schools appear to less utilizing this critical educational heritage in Islam, and therefore may lack language of reconciliation between Islamic and Western educational vision or values. So for those who are interested, I have written a rather long review of the current literature, particularly the literature that deals with broad questions around Islam, Muslims, and education, framed within different European contexts, including North America and Australia. And by the way, most of these studies that they look at the question of Islam, Muslims, and education, they generally fall on some deeper theoretical positions exemplified by widely known theories like political scientists like Rawls and Habermas and McIntyre. Uh, However, it does appear to be that this liberal political, in a way, flexible framing of the issue actually, in the long run, doesn't appear to be a real solution because they do not appear to be accounting for the fact that we are dealing, quote unquote, non-European educational traditions trying to be recognized and accommodated within essentially a European framing of the issues. In other words, it does appear to be that there's not much really interest in the important topic of decolonizing the study of religions in general and including religious education in a way that it will reflect genuine acknowledgement of what Islamic education, for example, could bring to this new context and why Islamic education, the way it is accommodated, could be part of also rethinking the wider education policies in these countries. In other words, most of the theories used do not really count for the fact that we do need a process of decolonizing, particularly the study of religions, including Islam and Muslims, and Islamic education. We have to bear in mind, as we just mentioned, across Europe there are diverse political and legal framings of how religion or religions, religious education or faith schools should appear in their systems. So if you take a religious education, the way in which there is a provision for study of religious education within the secular curriculum, we could notice that there are obviously strict secular separation models, i.e. the French model, where probably the interest is not in religious education, but in a kind of a secular phenomenological study of religions, usually framed as religious studies, which is also popular in America. But there are also denominational, what we can call confessional approaches and new confessional approaches to accommodate religious education in different forms. And these are widely observable in continental Europe. And there are obviously non-confessional inclusive models of accommodating religions um, uh, within the secular educational system. Some might feel that these are actually ultimately models of assimilating religions within the, even the rubric of worldview studies of worldviews, a kind of a form of ethics and philosophy class. So in other words, some of these inclusive models of accommodating religious education, in order to emphasize the non-confessional nature of the activity or its educational contribution, they actually gradually end up with advocating a much more overtly secular model that is, for example, currently in discussion in Britain, that is even to replace the title of religious education with a generic title like worldviews, which I believe really ends up ultimately making RE becoming less recognizing social or educational significance of religions, but simply advocating religions to be just a content within a wider critical, ethical, or philosophical study. And in that way, I do believe that the so-called inclusive models are at the very danger of actually losing sight of the actual content of this particular way of accommodating study of religion or religious education in the system. So there are these diverse models, and most of you are familiar with these models, and you probably work and research within these models. There isn't really one particular model, and we have to bear in mind that Islamic education or Islamic religious education are framed within these existing frameworks, basically. And this is part of the problem a little bit, because these particular settlement models of accommodating religions within the mainstream secular education directly go back to the specific historical legacies, religious legacies of these countries. Islam somehow feels a bit awkward in being placed within such a narrative. So that is a part of the dilemma and difficulty in framing the activity of teaching and learning of Islam within these existing frameworks. Now, similar diversity is also observable in the way in which faith schools are accommodated. We all know that within the democratic political system, right to education is undeniable to the families and the communities, because both families and communities have got the right to be able to transmit their cultural religious values to their offsprings. But such practice might be seen as a kind of a clash with the wider expected secular educational values, particularly in the areas of personal autonomy, civic integration, where obviously such a faith-based educational activity would be seen as a form of instruction, or in fact sometimes indoctrination, that have got no place in contemporary democratic societies in Europe. So to kind of summarize the key point here, is we have to look at how Islam is taught, represented in different state schools, or we can call it mainstream schooling system. This could be publicly funded schools that have got Islamic ethos or character. And also there are diverse confessional and non-confessional classes on Islam. So in other words, there is this difficulty of qualifying a concept like Islamic religious education or Islamic education when you attend to this complexity at the background. So that takes us directly to the heads-on, to the conceptual confusion that I would like to really draw on your attention to. This is something I've picked up in the piece I've written in the book as well. There is this lack of clarifying what really we mean by these key concepts. So we do tend to use this concept, religious education, Islamic education, Muslim education. However, we do not necessarily always qualify these expressions. So looked at from the conceptual confusion clarity point of view, expression Islamic religious education seems to be really a vague way of framing the topic, although with all due respect, it is the title of the book. And I know that both the introduction and several contributions pick up on this vagueness and acknowledge the kind of lack of clarity on these concepts. But I would like to mention that this is not simply a problem of, qualifying the term with Islam, but it generally felt to be kind of an anomaly and a confusion. For example, recently, the concept of Catholic religious education has been picked on and rightly, critically interrogated the degree to which such a concept should be really used. In other words, if we are referring to RE as a curriculum subject, even in a school that has a religious character, this RE is supposed to be following the regulations put forward, legislation put forward within that particular subject. So there shouldn't be really a particular Catholic or non-Catholic or Islamic, non-Islamic way of teaching religious education. Of course, there could be some adjustment to the content to reflect the priority of the school, but ultimately qualifying religious education as having a specific religious flavor, it just doesn't help at all, because that is no longer the subject that is being put forward. So the expression Catholic religious education is suggested to be quite confusing, and I wholeheartedly agree. The same confusion is with the concept of Islamic religious education. I do understand that that also reflects because in continental Europe we have denominational educational system when it comes to theology, when it comes to organization of mainstream religious classes in the schooling system. But when you reflect on the concept, you realize actually it doesn't add much. In other words, Islamic education or Catholic education might make much more sense. You can't really qualify religious with another religious qualification. However, the danger of overly using analytical philosophy or a conceptual analysis might actually takes us back to a fundamental problem that has been picked up by highly ideologically driven educational philosophers. I refer to two influential figures. This is Paul Hurst and Peters, as they've amplified and then discussed from the secular perspective, really, or the secular logic of education that is operational within the liberal democratic societies today in Europe. Actually, if you use that logic, it appears to be expressions like even Christian education is basically a contradiction in terms. And this is because, again, the fundamental idea is that contemporary education is based on the liberal insight that all education has to sponsor, empower the individual learner, their autonomy, agency, and help them to become fully functioning citizens. And in their view, this can only be achieved if you take away any kind of religious residue or relic from the educational system, because religious education, although they tend to have an educational view, but from the perspective of these philosophers, this particular ethos really could be classified as a primitive, quote unquote, educational goal. It can only function as a nurture, transmission, indoctrination, instruction. A religiously framed educational activity apparently cannot really sponsor individual autonomy. We know that these are assumptions made by many secular educational philosophers and policymakers. And also we know that after decades and decades of reflection and resistance from people who are working within the faith traditions as educators, by using a critical theology, they have challenged this particular assumption. And one of those who have challenged this assumption is my own mentor, John Hull, late John Hull, who have famously written against, particularly Paul Hurst and his logic of education or forms of knowledge, as he used to call it, and making a case that actually Christian theology could have a conversation with secular educational theory, and this conversation could be quite fruitful for both, really. And I tend to think that despite shortcomings of depicting an area, religious or non-religious, we have to acknowledge that these different educational traditions, be it again secular or religious, they really need to complement one another. After all, the secular assumption as if secular education has got no values, it's all objective, it's all sponsoring autonomy of the learner is obviously a fallacy, really, because in the name of secular education, for example, scientism could become another form of indoctrination. And the emphasis on science is well known within the current educational systems. So we understand and appreciate that education as a human activity will always remain value laden. And as such, education could be qualified religiously, morally, and culturally. And there is no really harm in this. And these different logics of education could actually have a fruitful critical conversation. So while Islamic religious education as an expression, I find it very limiting and narrow and probably a little bit incomprehensive, but at the same time, I am of the view that overemphasizing the separation and the conflict between religious and secular educational ethos is also unhelpful. And the fact that education is an extension of human culture and activities, makes us realize the richness and diversity in these different educational systems. An idea is to open up these different languages of education to learn from one another. So if we close in expression Islam education, Islamic education, Muslim education, and whether Islamic education is a form of instruction, nurture, we have this rather confusing set of further expressions. I would like to offer maybe a couple of qualifications when we use these concepts. First of all, no matter how you frame them, Islamic religious education, Islamic education, Muslim education, the first qualification really is pedagogic in kind. That is all to do with how we teach and learn Islam. And this organization of teaching and learning, how it is put into practice in different contexts. So that will tell us what is really meant by Islam education. It could be only to do with detached study of Islam and its historical and contemporary expressions, for example. But at the same time, Islamic education could also refer to a wider effort to qualify education within Islamic value framework. Something I call it recognizing the fact that it is possible to say one has to maybe think Islam educationally, but at the same time one could actually Islamically frame educational activity. So that dialectic is always present, and this actually opens up possibilities of engaging critically with the deeper theological, cultural value basis of Islamic education or educational aims in Islam. And that is crucial in order to see how or what kind of Islamic education could be compatible with the current European context. So I really advocate to kind of bear in mind this important qualification that is something we call it an educational analysis of Islam itself to appreciate the educational pedagogic features of Islam, but at the same time, a deeper recognition that Islam within its core sources and diverse traditions have expressed different layers of educational values and educational activity. And we can call this a kind of an attempt to Islamically frame education. And I think these are very healthy, really, ways of framing the issue in order to not to be stuck with the conceptual confusion. And finally, this will open up a way to offer innovative thinking in Islamic education, particularly developing new theoretical insights. And that could have an impact on how we see the ethos of Islamic schooling, for example, because Islamic schooling becomes not simply a kind of a shorthand to separate Muslims from the non-Muslims within the educational space, but it could be an attempt to discover the rich educational heritage of Islam and try to present that to young European Muslims, and also include within that educational expression places and spaces for experiences of the learners, that is the Muslim learner. And that could shape Islamic schools, not only ethos, but also their curriculum and their pedagogic strategies, and all the way to probably models of Muslim teacher education in Europe. So this really conceptual confusion leads us to recognize the kind of interdisciplinary nature of Islamic education, and also the kind of theoretical depth that is attached to these discussions, albeit we don't have much debate about theological, for example, foundations of education in Islam by those who are currently part of Islamic schooling movement across Europe. At least I don't see much, unfortunately. So if you do not really unpack your own heritage, you obviously cannot discern diverse interpretations of education and Islamic heritage. And you will probably reduce to one activity, that is seeing Islamic education as a form of instruction or a simple unreflective nurture, and in fact, in sometimes indoctrination. So that conceptual confusion takes me to question probably two distinct political framings of the subject currently operational across Europe. That is, as we said, education is a value-laden process. In education in general, particularly religiously qualified education, is always prone to exhibit ideological choices and serve certain interests. So if you look at the kind of educational good that is intended to be achieved or served out of the practice of Islamic education, no matter how you frame currently, we realize a lot of interest by the secular state because it does appear to be Islamic education is a convenient space for the state to actually put into practice its security policies with the justification of ensuring the secular values of being a citizen are actually met. Or, in fact, one could be cynically expecting there is probably a further aim out of this exercise, that is to kind of forge a politically correct sense of being Muslim in modern Europe. So this kind of artificial but potentially dehumanizing and anti-democratic, I would say, utilization of education space within Muslim minority context. Now, in opposition to this ideological take, we also have to recognize the fact that Islamic education is also a part of transnational Islamic networks and their own interests. That includes sometimes parents. So, in other words, when we look at who Islamic education should serve, it turns out to be mainly it serves to the interests of the transnational Islamic networks because it's a good way of manipulating their power base. Also, sometimes it looks like it actually serves the interests of the parents who are keen on reproducing certain Islamic cultural identity narratives in their young people, regardless of the changes in the social context. So within this broad two power base, what happens to actual interest and the needs of European Muslim children and young people often really are not voiced at all. So in other words, there is an urgent need to rethink the educational ethos in Islamic schools by including or referencing the actual needs and experiences of young Muslims rather than assuming that they're simply there to be the passive recipients of whatever the parents or the community basically wants them to exhibit or demonstrate in their lives. So in other words, there is this interesting dilemma when you look at sociologically and politically how the educational good is actually framed by these different stakeholders. So that brings me to the very center of what I really would like to share with you, and particularly for you to consider, which are a list of questions that I've also set them in the piece I have written for the book. That is to, in order to really find out how Islamic schooling or Islamic education generally functions within the Muslim minority context of Europe, we really, particularly the European Muslim educators, they really look at closely how education is understood within diverse Muslim traditions. If we do not acknowledge this diversity, it is very difficult to make Islamic education as an empowering function in the life of young people who are, by definition, inheritors of dual heritage, that is Islamic as well as European cultural heritage. So we got to take the notion of plurality very seriously, not only internally but also externally. And then that will take us, those who are in charge of formulating, delivering these policies, enacting these policies in Islamic schools or Muslim education spaces, we really need to take into account how this kind of educational ethos and goods are negotiated. And we have to bear in mind that typically this will only include top to bottom approach. What we need to see is also recognition of what young learners, Muslim learners need. And that is also reflected in the educational ethos and the goal of these schools. And that takes us to a theologically very interesting question, is the degree to which Islamic nurture, for example, could be contextual, open, critical, capable of responding to the changing needs of European Muslim children and young people. Or education is always going to be imagined as a form of rigid cultural transmission, instruction, and indoctrination, incapable of generating a theological language of faith and personal development. And that obviously will bring about the fact that Islamic ethos education might also promote intra-faith diversity. And it is possible that even, as we just mentioned at the very start of the presentation, Islamically framed education may not necessarily conflict with secular goals of education. And that crucial point is, for example, civic education. Could we talk about Islamic version of civic education, democratic education? In other words, could Islamic schools sponsor and support a concept that we can call nurturing pious citizenship in secular Europe? In fact, we just have a project, an interesting project just launched at Warwick that is going to investigate this very question. And finally, when we talk about the language of diversity and difference, this is in no way to marginalize traditions of Islam that are observed across Europe, but actually to ensure that the kind of diversity discerned or the reality of different interpretations of Islam exhibited in across Europe are really there not to diminish that there is actually a core sense of being Muslim, strong sense of being Muslim present across all these interpretations of Islam. So in other words, the shorthand phrase that there are as many Muslims as many Islams as there are many Muslims may sound nice, but really this is a kind of relativity invoking expression that is, I think, it's misguided because the hermeneutic strategy itself needs to have some ethical bearings and ethical awareness. So if you think with this mind, I would say the diversity in terms of the interpretation of Islam should not be advocating a radical relativism where you end up having no core values at all. And it becomes just within the market space as a kind of a commodity to be used and then left. But really, religious traditions are not like this. There are diversity of traditions, but within these traditions, we always have a clear sense of belonging, observable within these communities. All we want to make sure that young people have got the chance on critically reflecting of this religious sense of belonging in a way that it will not marginalize any of these expressions. In fact, it will invoke curiosity among the members of these diverse interpretations to be open to one another. So I think I've spoken quite a lot. I'm just trying to wrap up my presentation. You can see that what I'm advocating is not specifically how sociologically Islamic schools function, interpret their ethos, which is an important question, but really I'm into the wider issue. That is, can we make Islamic education studies as an interdisciplinary field of study where we investigate all kinds of theoretical, practical issues to do with Islamic education, that is, learning and teaching of Islam, its theories, practices, and how they could engage with diverse religious education systems within European traditions. All of this requires actually to kind of move away from a taken for granted perception of Islamic education, but an Islamic education field that is confident enough to open itself up to interdisciplinary scrutiny, examination, and it does not simply become a form of socialization or nurture. Therefore, in order to really find out how education spaces are utilized within European minority Muslim communities, is to advocate those who are part of that delivery of Islamic education to also gain research-based reflective skills, to be able to investigate the kind of field that they are more or less practicing. They are really professionals in many ways. And to give them that kind of set of skills, to be able to understand that education has theological as well as pedagogic, cultural dimensions. And all of this requires an awareness that education is religious or in secular context is always empowering if it opens up curiosity in the learners towards their own heritage, as well as a curiosity to engage in an understanding of other cultures and other religious traditions. In other words, Islamic education doesn't have to necessarily be simple instruction or nurture. It can be actually a wider field within which there are spaces for instruction and nurture, but both nurture and instruction could actually exhibit contextual critical features. So achieving this goal requires bringing about reflective voices within the traditions of Islam who are engaged in education. So we need more critical voices among the practitioners of Islamic education, and also unskilling and recognizing their resources, obviously, that they build up within the community. And that really brings about the importance of facilitating collaborative activities and projects between universities and diverse communities of Islamic education practitioners. And that really will have probably a positive impact on when it comes to considering how Islam is taught in, for example, mainstream RE models. In fact, further than that, why we need to facilitate critical Islam literacy and public understanding of Islam and Muslim within various educational spaces and activities. So all of this, as I say, require looking at Islamic education, first of all, reframing it as a proper field where you need to apply theological, sociological, psychological insights in order to understand how it is functioning, and clearly develop models of Islamic education practice that actually make sense within the context of Europe. So with this, I leave you with some selected references. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sure you're going to have a very exciting follow-up questions and responses. I'm afraid I won't be there to listen, but I'm hoping that what I have offered has hopefully facilitated some further questions. Thank you very much.